My name is Jessica VandenPlas. I work at OptiBrand Rx, and we are a sort of full-service market research firm. We do everything in-house. And one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is sort of finding insights beyond what our respondents are telling us, right? Beyond what the doctors, patients, caregivers might say they do or believe or like. We try and dig a little bit deeper than that. And so a lot of the ways that we do that are utilizing some of this technology. And so I want to talk today in particular about the hidden insights of microexpressions. Microexpressions are something we've been using in market research for a long time, but recently it's been sort of in the news as a little bit controversial. I know many of you may have seen that Microsoft, for example, has pulled facial analysis from a lot of their software, citing privacy concerns, which we should all be worried about, but also citing a little bit of concern about sort of the validity of it as a sort of scientific discipline. So I want to talk a little bit about the ways that we do it, the way that it can be scientific, and the way that it can lead to insights beyond what people are telling us in the research that we're doing. So the first thing is, if you're not familiar with microexpressions, these are the involuntary sort of facial expressions that we make as we're going about our day-to-day lives. And I think that the key piece to that is that they're involuntary. What that means is that they're reflecting emotions that you may or may not know that you're having, but these are happening all of the time. And you have to really consciously think if you want to try and suppress these. So in a normal conversation, you're flashing hundreds and hundreds of these microexpressions that can give us some insights into the types of emotions you're feeling. Are you engaged in the conversation? Are you afraid? Are you nervous? Are you really liking the conversation, right? So that subconscious piece of it is really hard for us to gather in traditional market research, right? I might be doing an interview or having someone take a survey online. Understanding their emotional state, the best we can do really is self-report, right? And that is done through a filter. They tell us either what they think we want to hear, or they tell us what they think they are feeling overall. The other thing about microexpressions that is nice is that we don't have to wait until the end of the interview or the end of the survey to say, how did you feel about this thing that you just read, right? What's the number one emotion you felt? These are in real time. So if we can tie these back to the stimulus, we can identify particular words, phrases, images, and the emotions that are tied to those particular pieces of the stimuli, rather than waiting to have to see sort of an overall sort of gestalt feeling when they get to the end of the stimulus, right? So this is a piece that we can layer on, not research on its own, but layer onto a survey, an interview, some other type of market research to add this extra dimension of insights that might be difficult to capture through a traditional self-report. The reason I say I think that it comes from a scientific basis that we need to acknowledge is that this research has been going on since the early 1960s, and it is based on a scientific underpinning of something called the facial action coding system. So the facial action coding system has taken each little muscle twitch that you can think of in your face and given it a code, and then it has grouped some of those codes together to say that, for example, when your eyebrows lower a certain degree and your lower lips start pressing firmly and your eyes start bulging a certain percentage, that means you're confused, right? We all kind of know what confusion looks like if it is long-term sustained confusion, but you also can have a microexpression of confusion sort of flit across your face as you're interacting with something. And if you know anything about doctors, which I think you all do, all of them are going to admit when they're reading something that's confusing to them, right? So identifying what part was confusing, what part was unclear, what part gave them a second to pause, even if they were able to wrap around and figure it out later, is something that's really tough to do. And being able to tie a microexpression of confusion to a particular piece of the stimulus helps us to identify that without them having to recall, without them being able to filter out and say, oh no, everything made perfect sense to me, right? So looking at these individual action units allows us to have a sort of impartial, neutral way of categorizing these facial expressions and identifying these different emotions. And it's based on a strong sort of research foundation. The other piece that Microsoft is sort of calling out is that facial expressions are unique, right? We all make slightly different facial expressions to express different emotions. And so they said, how can you sort of generalize across a million billion people what their facial expressions mean? And so one of the things that we do is an individual calibration. We calibrate every individual's neutral face to identify what the movements are away from that neutral position and to help us understand on an individualized basis what those emotions look like for you. The other piece of this that's really important is that microexpressions are task dependent, right? What confusion looks like in one scenario might not be what confusion looks like in another scenario. So we also do this calibration for every task that we ask someone to do so that we have task-specific, person-specific calibration. And then the last piece of this is that if we also measure eye position, where someone is focusing as they are dealing with the stimulus, we can now identify not just task-specific, we can identify, like I said, an individual piece of the stimulus that is going to track back to that particular emotion. What we end up with is something that looks like this. We can track over the course of an interview, a survey, a conversation, what emotions are peaking at a particular point in time. And so you see here an overlay of some of the basic emotions. And what's nice about this is that there are timestamps here, right? So I might want to know what happened at 30 seconds into this stimulus that evoked this peak of surprise, right? If I get to the end of this and they say, oh, that was kind of surprising, and I say what part of it was surprising, they're going to have to recollect and go back and try and identify that. But if I know that at 30 seconds they felt surprise, and I can link that to their focal point where they were looking at that moment in time, I can also identify exactly what it was that caused that peak of surprise at 30 seconds. So this real-time tracking allows us to put these two technologies together to identify the emotion that you are feeling based on that physiological focus of where you're looking as you move through a stimulus. We can do this with any sort of visual stimulus. We can also do it during an interview, like I said, with a normal conversation. So whether you're looking at a TPP and you want to identify what parts are confusing, what parts do they like, what parts maybe do they not like, right? Disgust or anger or disappointment are also emotions that we can track as they're reading through something. Visual aids, of course, concepts, messages, anything that has text that you have to process visually is fantastic for this. Because again, we can break down individual words, individual phrases, images on the page, not just to understand how you move through them and process them visually, but what emotion does each of those particular pieces evoke? And that helps us to understand something that would be difficult for them to articulate in the moment, right? If we had them do sort of a think aloud protocol, they would be constantly interrupting their own thought process and emotional processing to try and think aloud. When we do retrospective reporting, again, they miss pieces, they may misremember. If it's a long conversation you're having, that's really difficult. But doing this allows us to collect that in a really non-invasive way in real time and to layer that onto the insights that we might get from their verbal responses, their written responses. The nice thing about this is that this technology now exists at a distance. We used to have to bring people into the lab, right, to do eye tracking, to do facial analysis. We bring them into the lab and we use dedicated equipment. But we now all sit in front of that dedicated equipment basically every day, right? You all sit in front of a webcam to have these conversations. Most of our research now is happening online. We're doing surveys online, we're doing interviews online, and using the webcam and a particular software to triangulate eye position and facial expression allows us to group all of those things into a single session that can be done remotely. So we can track emotion, we can track visual focus for any of those scenarios that we just talked about, and we can meet the participants where they are. The nice thing about this is that it also moves it away from something that we can only do in interviews where we might have 10, 20, maybe 30 people if we have a generous interview sample, to something that we can roll out with a survey that might have 100, 200, 300 respondents, right? So we can now get emotional analysis at scale for a huge group of people that allows us, again, to add that depth, add that richness to what they're telling us are their responses to these particular stimuli. So there's two really good questions there. One is that privacy concern, which again, I think is the main reason that Microsoft has abandoned this. I think they're trying to sort of push it off onto some of the scientific underpinnings, but I think it's a privacy concern. So we absolutely do warn folks ahead of time. In one of our recent surveys, I'd say we had about 90% people agree to allow the facial coding while they did the survey. The other 10% we sent down a different path where they see the same stimulus and answer the questions, but we just lack that triangulation piece. So I have been surprised that most of them have been okay with it. Also, once they've sort of consented to an online interview, they've basically already agreed to be on camera, so they don't seem as concerned about it. And then the other piece is, does telling them about this, like we warn them ahead of time, we tell them what's happening, does that change the way they respond? And I think what Stu said is exactly right, which is that the first thing is micro-expressions, you can suppress them, right? Really good con artists can suppress micro-expressions. That is a whole field we can get into. but it's really purposeful and it really requires a lot of effort. And so in the course of normal market research, I think the stakes are pretty low for our respondents. For them to go through the bother of deception, I think is tricky. I think that they do frequently tell us what we want to hear. And so we have to, as part of the process, sort of tease those things apart. But I think that they don't intend to lie to us when they're doing that. They're telling us what they think is the right answer. The micro expressions, they would have to really try to lie to us, right? They can't even really fake an expression. It's tough to feign interest, as many of you in the audience know right now. So I do think it has the potential for bias, but I think with the micro expressions piece, it's much, much tougher.